It was the 14th day of Nisan in the year 33 after Christ. In an upper room, hidden within the stone labyrinth of Jerusalem, a man made a gesture with a piece of bread, a movement that lasted less than 30 seconds. In that exact instant, the action was met with absolute silence by the 12 men present in the room. No army was summoned, no weapon was raised. But in the decades that followed, this single brief movement would shake the Christian world. It struck with a force that no Roman emperor, no relentless persecution, and no imperial decree could ever achieve. The colossal divide sparked by this act did not come from outside enemies trying to extinguish the new faith. It came from within the house itself, and it is a deep historic fracture that 2,000 years later still remains unanswered. To understand the gravity of this rupture, we must step back. We must feel the atmosphere just outside those walls. Jerusalem, on that 14th day of Nisan, was suffocating. It was operating at the absolute limit of its capacity. The city saw its population triple, flooded by a relentless tide of pilgrims. Through the narrow, dusty alleys, the political tension was a rope stretched to the breaking point. Imperial patrols remained on high alert upon the fortifications. They knew that any spark amidst this religious fervor could ignite an uncontrollable revolt. The monumental temple operated day and night. It was a tireless engine of sacrifice, dictating the pulse of the entire nation. Inside that private room, however, there was no room for chance. Popular culture has often crystallized this in the collective imagination as a makeshift farewell meal. But in pure reality, it was the rigorous rite of the Jewish Seder. It was a ceremony with a meticulously constructed script. Its elements and words had been forged and kept intact over 15 centuries. Every raised cup, every shared piece of food, every silence held a fixed place. It held an undeniable theological meaning, leaving absolutely no margin for last-minute changes. Jesus knew perfectly well the fate that awaited him in the darkness of that very dawn. He knew his steps in freedom were numbered. He knew that in just a few hours he would be judged, condemned, and handed over to the ultimate torment. Facing a stealthy and inescapable siege, he made a choice. Dedicating his final hours in isolation with those 12 men around that specific table was not a reaction of despair. It was not passivity. It was an act of pure intentionality. The great question echoing through the walls of time is immediate. Why did such a simple act, performed in the shadows of a private room with a small group of followers, cause a tectonic shift? A shift capable of fracturing a belief system for 2 millennia? The hidden power that breathes life into the tradition of Corpus Christi today does not rest in silver monstrances. It does not live in the annual processions that gather massive crowds. The true power is rooted in what happened long before any public celebration was ever designed. The origin of this impact is not in the feast itself. It is in the misunderstood weight of what preceded it. Shadows fell over Jerusalem early that evening, bringing a biting chill to the stone streets. To an outside observer, the capital of Judea seemed ready to collapse under its own weight. It was the season of the Jewish Passover. The city's usual population had surged to more than 200,000 inhabitants in a matter of days. The air was choked with smoke and the scent of incense. It rose without pause from the temple grounds, operating day and night in an exhausting cycle of sacrifices. High up in the fortresses, The Roman imperial guard watched every alley, their eyes fixed on the crowd. The soldiers were on high alert. Any misplaced word, any suspicious gathering of pilgrims could trigger a clash of uncontrollable proportions. The entire city breathed a heavy air. It was a nervous anticipation you could almost touch with your hands. The political environment was a rope stretched to its absolute limit. Before we cross the doors of that upper room and understand what really happened at that isolated table, I quickly ask for your like. It helps this documentary reach more people. It greatly values all the research work done to bring these historical stories to you with the proper depth. And so I can better know who is watching today. Leave your answer in the comments. Do you live out the Christian faith in your daily life? Do you enjoy studying the artifacts and mysteries of the Bible on your own? Or are you simply passionate about ancient history and archaeology? I will read and answer every comment. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let us return to that silent night. While the city boiled on the outside, the atmosphere in the upper floor of that house was one of uncompromising solemnity. The meal being served, there was not a casual gathering of friends discussing the dangers of that week. It was the Seder, the most sacred and unchanging rite of the Jewish calendar. For those 12 men, sitting at that table meant stepping into a millennia-old script. Every object on the wood, every bitter herb, every piece of unleavened bread had an exact theological function. Nothing was there by chance, and every gesture performed by the host carried 15 centuries of fixed, unalterable meaning. It was passed strictly from father to son since the Exodus from Egypt. There was no room for hesitation. There was no margin for improvisation. But a heavy, invisible shadow shared the room with them. Jesus knew perfectly well what was happening in the dark streets just below. He knew that one of his followers had already stood up, left the room in silence, and was hurrying through the alleys to hand him over to the religious authorities. The clock of history had begun to tick toward its conclusion. Yet there was no despair in that room. There was no escape, no fiery speeches of defense. Jesus continued to lead the ceremony with a calmness that defied reason itself. The decision to remain secluded, to look those men in the eyes and see the right through to the end, was not the act of someone surrendering to fate. It was a surgical, lucid, and deeply intentional choice. He needed that encounter to happen exactly under those conditions. It was against this backdrop of unbearable pressure, with legions patrolling the city gates and betrayal walking in the dark, that the meal moved forward, and it was at the exact moment tradition demanded he repeat the same acts consecrated for 15 centuries that Jesus performed a gesture absolutely no one in that room was expecting. The meal followed its relentless course, dictated by 15 centuries of custom. Upon the rustic table, lit by the flickering light of oil lamps, rested the unleavened bread, known as matzah. It was not just any food. For any first-century Jew, that unleavened bread was the object most heavily loaded with the collective memory of their entire culture. It represented the haste, the flight from Egypt, the liberation from slavery. Whenever the host raised it, the words that followed were strictly known by everyone present. It was the non-negotiable liturgy of a people's survival. But on that night of maximum tension, tradition was suddenly broken. Jesus took the bread, he broke it, and in the dense silence of that room, he uttered a short phrase that was not in any scroll. It was not in any rite. nor in the memory of any past generations. In Aramaic, the harsh and direct language spoken on the streets of Judea, he said, "This is my body." For the ears of future generations, accustomed to hearing these words in solemn and protected ceremonies, the original impact is lost. But for those 12 men, the statement was a blow of absolute disorientation. That bread already held a sacred, untouchable meaning. In a matter of seconds, Israel's oldest symbol was redefined right before their eyes. The silence that overtook the upper room was not one of peace. It was of sheer astonishment. Those men were not beginners in the faith. They were not naive followers who accepted any mystery without question. Months earlier, as chapter 6 of the Gospel of John reports, a very similar declaration had been made in broad daylight. The words were so hard to digest that the result was drastic. A large portion of his followers turned their backs and abandoned him immediately, considering it an intolerable violation of purity laws. The 12 knew the scandal those words provoked. They knew what it meant to say something like that in Israel, and now, isolated in that upper room, with temple guards and imperial troops patrolling the city, they heard the same decree, not as a speech on the hills, but as a definitive sentence across that table. The shockwave did not stop there. The rite demanded that cups of wine be raised at very specific moments. When it was time for the cup after supper, Jesus took it in his hands, and once again, the ancient script was shattered. He declared that this cup was the new covenant in his blood. For anyone born and raised under the law, the word covenant was the most sacred, revered, and absolute concept of their existence. It was the foundation of the nation itself, and a blood covenant pointed directly back to ancient altars, to the blood marked on doorframes, to the uninterrupted sacrifices that at that very moment were taking place just miles away. Jesus was stating that the ancient system was about to meet its tragic and definitive end in him alone. None of them grasped the complete theology in those dim moments. The human shock was paralyzing. The act of breaking the bread and raising the cup lasted less than 30 seconds, but the rupture it caused in the foundation of the faith could not be contained within the walls of that upper room. What seemed like a quiet moment of farewell was, in truth, the starting mark of an unparalleled schism. The earthquake was just beginning, and the shock wave of those words was about to sweep across the Christian world for the next 2,000 years. The echo of the words spoken in the shadows of that upper floor did not stay confined to Jerusalem. In the decades that followed, the memory of the broken bread crossed the Mediterranean Sea. It reached the bustling ports and dark alleys of the ancient world. The initial shock was only just taking shape. We arrive at the year 55 after Christ. Christianity did not yet have grand cathedrals or massive street processions. The early communities of believers repeated the gesture of the upper room not once a year, but on a weekly basis. They gathered in secret on the first day of the week around common tables in the homes of their members. Before we dive into the conflicts that shook these early congregations, I want to take a brief pause. The expansion of the early church is a vital chapter in an infinitely larger narrative. If you wish to understand the entirety of sacred history with clarity, I warmly recommend the e-book, The Bible in Chronological Order. It reorganizes the sacred texts from Genesis to Revelation. It reveals that the Bible is not just a book, but a formidable library of 66 works, written over roughly 1,500 years. Reading the scriptures while understanding the exact historical sequence allows the reader to see prophetic connections. You can see divine patterns and the true guiding thread of redemption. The link is in the description, and it will be a valuable tool for your faith. Now let us return to our story. In the port city of Corinth, one of the most ruthless commercial hubs of the Roman Empire, the repetition of that weekly rite began to crumble. Human nature, loaded with flaws, corrupted the solemnity of the table. The gatherings turned into a brutal mirror of the era's inequality. On one side of the room, men of wealth ate in abundance and grew drunk on wine. On the other side, manual laborers and slaves went hungry during the exact same celebration. The act that was created by Jesus to symbolize an unbreakable covenant was, in practice, being used to humiliate the most vulnerable. It is exactly in the midst of this documented chaos that the oldest record we possess of the supper emerges, a parchment written by Paul of Tarsus. It was dated years before the Gospels we know today took their final written form. Paul does not use soft tones. He intervenes in the Corinthian crisis with surgical hardness. In his lines, he warns that the celebration was no ordinary meal. Anyone who ate the bread without properly discerning the body was not just committing a moral slip in etiquette. They were drawing severe judgment upon themselves. The apostles' ice-cold reprimand fell like a heavy weight upon the communities. It was the first major boundary imposed on the celebration. From that point on, the gesture had to be shielded. The common meal began to be separated from the solemn act. The bread demanded barriers of protection, of extreme reverence, and an isolated space far away from human thoughtlessness. The first tremor had been contained by the apostolic letters. Rules of respect were established, and silence once again reigned around the rite. But the real storm had not passed. The definitive shock wave, the one that would crack the Christian world irreparably, was still being forged in the shadows. And it would not come from the abuses of a corrupt city. It would come from within, from the deep theological heart of the church itself. Decades pushed forward and turned into centuries, but the echo of that room in Jerusalem found no rest. The central question left open by that night's gesture became an open wound at the core of the faith. When the man broke the unleavened bread and spoke that phrase, was he speaking literally? Did the bread and wine become, in a physical and spiritual dimension, his very being? Or was that the deepest, most reverent metaphor ever conceived, an unbreakable symbol of memory? The attempt to answer this single question tore Christianity apart from top to bottom. No persecution, no arena of wild beasts, and no Roman imperial decree caused a divide as profound as the interpretation of those brief seconds. As time went on, the Christian world splintered into three irreconcilable currents, all facing the exact same table. On one side, the vision solidified that a real transformation occurred. It was invisible to human eyes, but absolute in its essence. The physical matter of the bread gave way to a physical and divine presence. On another side stood the firm conviction that the rite was a sacred memorial, a symbolic representation of a sacrifice already completed, with no alteration to the physical matter. And in a third stream, the acceptance of an unfathomable mystery took hold. The belief that a definitive change happened, but that the human mind should never try to define it with the limits of earthly philosophy. Three traditions, the exact same piece of bread, the same phrase spoken in ancient Aramaic, a deadlock that no grand council, no theological debate, and no leader could ever pacify. The table designed in the first century to unite 12 men became the impassable border separating empires of faith. It is precisely at the peak of this colossal identity crisis that the narrative takes a decisive leap. We fast forward to the 13th century. Europe was buzzing under the weight of building the first great stone cathedrals. In the streets and inside the monasteries, the doubt over what truly happened the moment the bread was raised grew silently and dangerously. Religious leadership desperately needed an anchor. They needed a visual, public, and unquestionable statement. It was in this setting of imminent fracture, not in a time of peace, that the seed of Corpus Christi was planted. The year was 1264. Creating this feast was not just a whim of the liturgical calendar, it was a direct, almost defensive response, a reaction against the shock wave threatening to collapse the understanding of the sacred. They had to drag the debate out of the shadows of the libraries and into the sunlight. The celebration was conceived to declare, in front of massive crowds on the streets, that the presence was real and undeniable. It was a bold attempt to silence the doubts eating away at the congregations from the inside. Behind the gold of the reliquaries that would soon parade through the world's squares, there lay a hidden tension. It was a monumental attempt to heal the rupture opened by that simple gesture. However, what the official pages of history often hide is that the decree instituting this universal celebration did not hatch from the intellect of the comfortable halls of power in Rome. The force driving this tectonic shift began in the quiet, solitary stubbornness of an orphan woman. Her convictions were about to challenge the silence of her era against all odds. Her name was Juliana. Born at the end of the 12th century, she was orphaned at 5 years old. She was placed in the care of a convent in Liège, in the territory we know today as Belgium. It was in the damp, cold silence of those stone corridors that the seed of Corpus Christi truly sprouted. Far from the power struggles in Rome and the roar of the crowds, the origin of the feast that would paralyze the Christian world rested in the mind and the anguish of a solitary woman. At 16 years of age, Juliana began to be haunted by a recurring vision. It was an image that would track her relentlessly for the decades to come. She saw a full moon, bright and imposing, yet carrying a dark stain, a deep crack in its brightness. The interpretation she took for herself was singular and striking. The moon represented the church, and the dark stain was the historical absence of a celebration dedicated exclusively to honoring the bread shared on that tense night in the upper room in Jerusalem. For 40 years, Juliana fought with almost zero support. In an era where female voices in ecclesiastical halls were frequently ignored or silenced, she faced rejection, mockery, and exile. Her convictions bothered the authorities, but her unwavering persistence began to crack the local defenses. In the year 1246, the Diocese of Liège gave in. They celebrated, quietly and regionally, the first feast honoring that gesture. It was a victory, but Juliana would not live to see what her vision would cause throughout the rest of the world. She passed away before the date ever crossed the borders of her city. However, the shock wave she had started in the shadows could no longer be contained. The point of no return would happen a few years later in the year 1263. The historical narrative transports us to the small town of Bolsena on the Italian peninsula. A Bohemian priest known as Peter of Prague, was making a long pilgrimage to Rome. He carried a crushing burden with him. That exact same millennial question dividing the faith was eating away at his mind. Was the bread truly the physical presence, or just a symbolic memory? While he was conducting the ceremony in Bolsena, the unexplainable happened right before his eyes. At the exact moment he spoke the ancient words, tradition and documents record that the host began to shed crimson drops. It permanently stained the white linen spread across the altar. The priest, utterly stunned, stopped the act. He brought the stained cloth to the neighboring city of Orvieto, where the Pope was residing at that time. This very linen, kept strictly under lock and key, is preserved and revered to this modern day. Faced with the marked fabric and pressured by the memory of Juliana of Cornillon's relentless effort, Pope Urban IV made the decision that sealed history. The following year, in 1264, he drafted an official document. It transformed the local feast of that Belgian orphan into a universal obligation for the entire Christian world. Corpus Christi was officially born. To grant the literary and theological weight that the new date demanded, the Pope summoned the most brilliant mind of his generation. A Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas was put in charge of composing the offices and hymns for the feast. The words Thomas wrote with his quill, blending precision and deep reverence, are the exact same hymns sung by crowds today. They have crossed the centuries completely intact. The shockwave had been institutionalized. The festival took over the public squares. It dressed itself in sculpted monstrances and covered the streets with colorful carpets. However, the true power of that day did not live in papal decrees or in the flawless poetry of Thomas Aquinas. The power was rooted long before all of that, just waiting to be understood. Today, through the streets of ancient cities around the entire world, colorful carpets are meticulously drawn on asphalt and cobblestones. Gold, silver, and incense pave the way for monumental processions that gather uncalculable crowds. The solemn sound of bells and the marching of the faithful echo against the walls of grand cathedrals. They set the rhythm for one of the most visual and magnificent celebrations of the entire Christian faith. The solemnity of Corpus Christi, in its modern attire, is a spectacle of reverence. It is a public display of strength and belief that dominates liturgical calendars. But to grasp the true magnitude of it all, we must push aside the glare of the golden reliquaries and wave away the thick smoke of the incense. We must strip history of its secular layers and return to ground zero. We have traveled a dense journey. We walked from the unbearable tension suffocating Jerusalem on the 14th day of Nisan in the year 33 after Christ. We passed through the chaos of divided tables in Corinth during the 1st century. We crossed the agonizing silence of an orphan's visions in the region of Flanders. We witnessed the shock at the altar in Bolsena, all the way to the definitive decree of Pope Urban IV in the 13th century, and the immortal hymns written by Thomas Aquinas. It is a formidable trajectory spanning almost 1,200 years just to consolidate a single feast. Yet, absolutely all of this, every theological debate, every rupture, every document, kept under lock and key in the deep archives of the Vatican, converges on one single, silent moment in time. Let us return, for the final time, to that upper floor hidden in the tangle of buildings in Jerusalem. The city is boiling on the outside, Roman imperial troops are stationed on the fortifications. The shadow of the ultimate torment is already creeping stealthily through the cold alleys. And inside, far from the clash of swords and the political negotiations of the Sanhedrin, Jesus makes a restrained gesture that lasted less than 30 seconds. He did not draft a complex philosophical treaty. He did not summon an army to fight the tyranny of the era. He did not establish a bureaucratic structure for his succession. He simply took a piece of unleavened bread, the food that carried the memory of runaway slaves, the bread of haste and affliction. He broke it with his own hands, and in the dense, heavy silence of that room, he handed the piece to the 12 men present with a declaration that would shatter the world irreversibly. "This is my body." Why did this single phrase endure? Why did such a simple act prove to be infinitely more lasting and powerful than the Roman legions patrolling Judea? The answer lies in the extreme difficulty of its proposal. The hidden power behind Corpus Christi and behind the sacrament of the supper itself does not rest in how easy it is to understand. On the contrary, the power is in the radical demand it makes on the human mind. When Jesus spoke those words, he placed before his followers and all future generations the ultimate test of trust. Accepting that the divine chooses to hide within the ordinary, that the creator of the universe makes himself present in the simplicity of daily food, demands we abandon mathematical certainties. It demands that leap into the void we call faith. The colossal divide that cracked the church throughout the following centuries is not a sign that the gesture failed. Paradoxically, the fracture is the greatest evidence of the immeasurable weight of that moment. If the breaking of bread were merely a common farewell meal, it would have been completely forgotten the moment the walls of Jerusalem fell, and the temple was reduced to ruins in the year 70 after Christ. But it did not vanish beneath the rubble. Humanity has debated, argued, and divided itself for more than 20 centuries precisely because it recognizes deep within its soul that something of eternal proportions happened upon that table. The mind of man fights fiercely to try to explain the exact mechanics of a mystery designed only to be lived and accepted. The bread and the wine carry a harsh and painful poetry within them. It is perfectly aligned with the destiny of the man who held them. For bread to exist and reach the table, the wheat must be mercilessly cut, threshed, and crushed beneath the unforgiving stone of the mill. Finally, it must be subjected to burning fire. For wine to be served in the cup, the grapes must be torn away and trampled in the darkness of the winepress. They are crushed until they lose their original form and pour out their entire essence. The visual metaphor is inescapable. On that night, the 12 disciples stood before the wheat that would be crushed and the grape that would be trampled in the coming hours. They looked at the man about to face the fury of the empire and the hostility of his own people's leaders. He was accepting to pay the ultimate price to establish the foundation of a new and definitive covenant. Along the spiral of time, whenever communities gather, that exact same table in Jerusalem is invisibly recreated. Whether in the dark secrecy of ancient catacombs, under the constant threat of emperors, in the architectural majesty of grand European cathedrals, or in the humility of a small dirt-floor rural chapel. Physical time runs backward. The chronology of men collapses. The first century directly touches the present day. This is the longest most consistent, uninterrupted ritual in the entire history of human civilization. And it is not sustained by the force of imperial or papal decrees. It is sustained by a living memory that stubbornly refuses to be forgotten. At the end of all things, the question Jesus left hanging in the air of that upper room was never truly about the properties of that bread. The question always was, and still is, about the inside of the human heart, about how genuinely capable we are of believing in what our eyes cannot dissect. The great force running through the Bible is not just the accuracy of its immemorial historical accounts, it is how its narrative exposes our weaknesses, our chronic doubts, and our profound need for salvation. Jesus offered us his presence. The promises of God and the magnificent love of God were not handed to the world in the shape of distant or unattainable philosophical formulas. They came in something a human being could see, smell, and touch. For all those who seek to live under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, constant prayer and unwavering hope are not empty concepts meant only for scholars. They are the active, daily response to this silent invitation made 2,000 years ago. May this story always remind us that the greatest earthquakes in the human trajectory do not always begin with the piercing sound of trumpets. They do not start with the terrifying roar of war battalions charging across the plains. Sometimes, the central event that irrevocably changes the course of eternity happens in the shadows, far from the eyes of the world, in absolute silence, through a restrained gesture that lasts a mere 30 seconds. The mystery does not demand to be mathematically solved. It only demands to be revered. We have reached the end of another extensive historical and documentary investigation. If this dive into the real backstage of the first century brought a fresh perspective to your journey and enriched your understanding of the Scriptures, do not forget to leave your like and subscribe to keep following our work. Share your most honest impressions down below in the comments. How do you now perceive the weight of that silence that took over the room on the night of the supper? I will read your reflections. Thank you so much for closely following along with us to the very end. May peace accompany your steps today and always, and I will see you on our next discovery.